The Sackler family, meaning the family behind the largest opioid scandal, has funneled tens of millions of dollars to a non-governmental organization that actually advises both the White House and Congress on drug-related policy. And the institution has failed to disclose this very clear conflict of interest. Now, the piece reported by the New York Times is an explosive one, an incredibly important one that shows how these governmental and non-governmental organizations take money from certain special interests that then leads to the publication of studies that misinforms the policymakers at hand. And that is exactly what happened here with what the Sacklers did, according to the reporting from the New York Times. So I'm gonna read some of the relevant excerpts, but it's really important that you guys actually read the piece for yourselves. There's so many tidbits in there that we just don't have time to get into. But here is the gist of the story. According to Christina Jewett at the Times, the national academies have kept quiet about their decision to accept roughly $19 million in donations from members of the Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, the maker of the drug Oxycontin, and it's notorious for fueling the opioid epidemic. So $19 million is no joke, and the donations to the national academies began in the year 2000. By the time we hit 2017, they had already donated millions of dollars. So a $14 million donation was actually made in 2008 by Dr. Raymond Sackler and his wife Beverly Sackler. They did this through their foundation, and the National Academies continues to advise the government on drug policy, including painkillers. So unlike the World Health Organization, the Times writes, which was accused of being manipulated by Purdue and later retracted two opioid policy reports, the National Academies has not conducted a public review to determine if the Sackler donations influenced its policymaking, despite issuing two major reports that influenced national opioid policy. And by the way, we're gonna get into one of these reports, which was just rife with misinformation, unfortunately misinformed policymakers and led to additional prescriptions of these painkillers. One of those reports released in 2011 and now largely discredited claimed that 100 million Americans suffered from chronic pain, an estimate that proved to be highly inflated. I'm gonna get to the details on that report in just a moment, but understand how this works. Sackler family provides massive donations to the National Academies. The National Academies then puts out reports indicating that far more Americans are struggling with pain-related issues, chronic pain, than is actually happening in reality. And that report leads policymakers to agree to increasing or allowing for the increase of opioid-related prescriptions. And as we know, opioid deaths in this country skyrocketed. Addiction to opioids and then later heroin skyrocketed. I mean, we're still grappling with this epidemic as we speak, and the details are just so incredibly damning. Before we get to it, Cenk, what are your thoughts so far?
Yeah, so the bottom line is actually really easy to understand. They give tens of millions of dollars to this organization, and then this organization puts out a paper saying that 100 million, 42% of the country is in chronic pain. That's an absurd number. No doctor believes that number. That's preposterous. They should have laughed them out of the room instantly and questioned, hey, where's your funding coming from? Because that number makes no sense at all. And it turns out it's not just Purdue. One of the guys who wrote the report had his own company that was in the pain medication business. It's like the most biased report you could imagine. And the real number, by the way, according to doctors, is 7 to 21%. So I believe 7% makes sense in that ballpark. I'll trust the real doctors, right? But guys, this is how they buy off every part of our government, even the non-governmental organizations that then inform government decisions. And so they buy everything, because as long as the government allows them to sell heroin, they're gonna make so much money. By the way, government websites literally say that Oxycontin and heroin are in the same category of drugs. And that's of course why people got hooked on it. And then they went to heroin afterwards because it was cheaper. etc.
Cheaper, and it was after the government realized that there was an opioid epidemic, so they started to restrict the prescription of the drug. But at that point, so many Americans were hooked that they ended up turning to the black market for heroin, which, yes, was also cheaper and easier to obtain. Now, I wanted to give you those specific details. So Cenk mentioned panelists within the national academies who had their own organizations. So Dr. Richard Payne is a perfect example. He's with the American Pain Society Physicians Group. That group took $900,000 from the Sackler family. Another example, another panelist with the national academies was Myra Christopher. And Myra Christopher was actually swapping emails back in 2007 with Purdue staff about talking points to respond to news broadcasts that were critical of opioids. So at the time of that 2011 report that significantly overestimated how many Americans were dealing with chronic pain. Christopher was the president of the Center for Practical Bioethics, which was a nonprofit based in Kansas City, Missouri. Purdue gave that organization $934,770, okay? So let's get to the 2011 report and how that came to fruition, because Purdue Pharma, or a representative, I should say, for the National Academies claims this money that we took from the Sackler family had nothing to do with our decisions, okay? So Megan Lowry is her name, a spokeswoman for the National Academies, said in a statement that the Sackler donations were never used to support any advisory activities on the use of opioids or on efforts to counter the opioid crisis. However, take a look at this timeline of events and you can decide for yourselves. By the way, I think that these types of donations should be completely outlawed. The National Academies receive 70% of its funding from the federal government. They should not be allowed to take additional funding from, families that own pharmaceutical companies and have, a financial interest in being drug pushers. But nonetheless, the Pain Care Forum, which is a group co-founded by Bert Rosen, the Purdue lobbyist, pushed for legislation introduced in 2007 and 2009 that included calling for a National Academies report to increase the recognition of pain as a significant public health problem. Now, soon after the measure passed in 2010, Rosen convened the Pain Care Forum at a 10 p.m., meaning 10 o'clock at night gathering to focus on meetings with the Institute of Medicine, the former name for the National Academy of Medicine, and for membership on IOM committee, meaning the Institute of Medicine committee. At the same time, the National Academies was forming the committee that would produce its 2011 opioids report, which included the estimate that about 100 million, or 42% of American adults, were in pain, a figure that researchers later found to be significantly inflated. And I should note, in reference to what Cenk mentioned earlier, later the CDC did its own study into this, and they're like, no, not 41%. The number is actually closer to 7 to 21%.
Yeah. So look, this is so absurd because that Dr. Payne that Anna mentioned is a perfect example. First of all, let's note how funny it is that his name is Dr. Payne.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, it's Payne, but it is pronounced Payne, and he does work at the Pain Center, but that's Pain, as in the actual pain. Okay, so he's getting money. His organizations are getting money from both sides, right? You've got the organization we're talking about here, then you've got his Pain Institute, etc. And they're shoveling money towards this guy. And lo and behold, he says, wow, pain is a giant problem in America that could probably be fixed by this exact drug. Okay, and is it addicting? Well, I wouldn't worry about that. In another study that the Sacklers paid for, they concluded that people weren't really getting addicted to Oxy. It was, quote, a pseudo addiction.
Right.
Okay. So, but unfortunately, because mainstream media in this country has said that corporations giving money to politicians and government officials is perfectly normal and acceptable, and that we shouldn't be concerned about it, everybody does it in such brazen ways. So now after all those people died, now hundreds of thousands of people over all those years, now the New York Times writes a good story about, hey, maybe they shouldn't have taken the money a decade ago and maybe we should have been more vigilant, etc. I appreciate the story and it's a good piece of journalism.
It is, it's an excellent piece, yes.
Yeah, and from time to time, like we tell you all the time, the New York Times and other mainstream media, especially print outlets, do really good investigative pieces, right? But they'll forget about it. And tomorrow they'll be telling you that when Ted Cruz or Nancy Pelosi takes tens of millions of dollars from another drug company, that no, it doesn't affect them at all.
Well, it's interesting because they seem to report stories like this as if it's in a vacuum, when this type of corruption has really been indicative of our political system. It's now ingrained, baked into our political system. Every facet of our political system, whether we're talking about Congress, whether we're talking about the FDA, whether we're talking about, in this case, non-governmental organizations that advise on drug policy. And so the other point, the final point that I want to make about this is, oftentimes you will hear from Democratic politicians repeat that we believe in science. Science, science, science. We believe in science. But we also know that with the corruption that is allowed into these scientific studies. I mean, you have the Koch brothers who funded all sorts of nonsense junk science that minimized the impact of the climate emergency. They would fund entire science departments on university campuses to essentially sway the research that those campuses were doing on climate change. I give you that example in addition to this example to say that the science can be manipulated when corruption is introduced into the process. And that is what we're seeing here. And it's a scary world to live in when you don't know what to trust.
100%. And look, guys, there's good people that work at that organization. There's good doctors, scientists, etc. And in fact, when a couple of the preeminent scientists on the governing council of the organization found out that they had taken money from the Sacklers before writing that report, they had no idea, even though they were on the governing council. And that's part of how you, like media and political figures, etc. They all are so hush hush about the corruption and normalize it so much that even some people in their own organizations don't realize they're doing it. And when they found out, they were super pissed. So then they ask, hey, is there any way that we can pull that report back, right? And one of the people that are leading the organization says the classic Obama line, we don't look backwards, we look forwards.
It's so pathetic.
Yeah, well, that's if you committed crimes in the past, that's why you don't look backwards. Obama did that on behalf of George Bush and Dick Cheney. And in this case, they're doing it on their own behalf. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Had been a perfectly good organization for a long time and can be, but Anna's right. The minute you start taking that corporate money, it's good night, Irene. And by the way, I would argue the same thing happened to NPR. The minute they started taking the corporate money, all of a sudden all the progressives are bad, corporate status quo is awesome, etc. And then now corruption has become so standard that it's no longer the exception, it's the rule.
Yeah.
So that's why it's like when we criticize reporters, they feel like the fish that is being asked, how's the water? They're like, what water? Because they swim in corruption so much, they don't even see it anymore. I mean, look, these guys selling, in essence, heroin in suits is basically like the Mexican drug cartels coming in and going, hey, National Academy of Medicine, etc. Why don't I give you guys $19 million and then you write a report about how great the drug cartels are?
Yeah, listen, the Sackler family should be in prison. They should be in prison. How many Americans died because of their drug pushing? And there's no conversation about that. Obviously, they're going bankrupt, they're paying fines. I think drug traffickers should be in prison. These are drug traffickers. Finally, the same spokesperson from the National Academies, Megan Lowry, was asked like, all right, well, now that this is an issue, right? Conflict of interest, what are you guys gonna do about it? Lowry added that the organization had been prevented from returning the Sackler money because of legal restrictions and donor unwillingness to accept returned funds.
That's such a BS excuse.
It totally is.
Of course, look, you could do what other organizations like Tufts University have done, which is redirect the money to prevention and treatment of people who are addicted to these awful drugs that you had a huge hand in pushing forward. But the number one thing to take away from this story is as always, when the media tells you that the corporate money doesn't corrupt the politicians, the government officials, and the non-government organizations that they give money to, it is absurd. The whole point of that money is to corrupt, and it works almost every time. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.